Good evening, my name is Phil Kline, and I've had the pleasure of teaching at Liberty University School of Law since 2009. Prior to that time, I had the honor of serving in the Kansas legislature, was a district attorney and attorney general for the state of Kansas. To begin, I need to take you back to the winter of 2008. And it was a Friday evening, and I was speaking to a group that I had spoken to often before. They did not share my political perspective whatsoever. They were predominantly Democratic, they were liberal, and I was a conservative Republican. But I always enjoyed the dialogue because we actually had a very frank, honest, and substantive discussion when we got together. I love the name of the group. They called themselves the Romeos, which stood for Retired Old Men Eating Out. And so I had gone through my discussion of the events of the day, and I opened it up for questions, and one of the gentlemen in the group raised his hand, and I somewhat anticipated what might be on his mind, because the following Monday after this address, I would start the murder trial of a man that I had accused and charged with murdering a young girl named Lisbeth Wilson in July of 1974. And so it was a cold case that had been there for a while. It was a case that shocked the community, that went on unsolved for decades. And I had reopened the investigation, and we had finally found the person that we believed did it. We had charged him with rape and murder of this 13-year-old girl, and the trial was going to begin on Monday. And sure enough, that's what the gentleman was concerned about. And he said, "I have a question for you, Mr. Kline. Why in America does justice take so long? We understand it might have taken a while to get the evidence, but I'll tell you what, we know that the trial is going to last for weeks. And if you go through this trial and you find him guilty, he will have years and years of appeal. And we'll be reading about John Henry Horton for years to come, while Lisbeth Wilson has been in the grave since 1974. Why does justice take so long? You know, it's a good question. If you look in many places across the globe, justice seems to be much more swift. And some would say certain. And so I thought it a good question. And I knew, you see, that what he was saying was true. I have prosecuted numerous people, and for years afterwards, they had every avenue open to them to try to prove something. Even what some might consider a technicality had gone wrong. Even if they were guilty, they deserved to be released because of some flaw in the process. I said, you know, that is an excellent question. And it harkens back to a promise. A promise made at this nation's founding. A promise reflected in this nation's founding documents, that we hold certain truths, not proclivities or preferences, but self-evident, external to us truths. Not truths proclaimed by man, but truths proclaimed by a higher moral authority. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And here's the role of government. Here's the jurisdiction afforded to government. Not to create the rights. The rights were created by a higher moral authority than man, higher moral authority than government. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. John Henry Horton, we recognize the truth of the fact. The man that I was accusing of murder was created in the image of God. So even so, I believe he committed a heinous act. Even though you believe he committed a heinous act. Even though the judge might believe he committed a heinous act. And after trial, 11 of 12 jurors believe he committed the act. If one has a doubt, to deliver on the promise of that truth, he will walk out an innocent man. That's why justice takes so long in America. And thank God that it does. I get the opportunity now and then to speak to a lot of groups of your peers. And generally, I like to speak to them about the significance of truth, the importance of truth. If you pause for a second and just, well, you don't have to listen quietly, because our culture is very loud in proclaiming it. There is a statement that truth is dead, that all things are relative, that truth no longer exists. So I like to speak about the importance of truth in law, the importance of truth as a foundation of relationship, the importance of truth in all of creation, and the importance of truth in our passion for life. I mean, when you think about it, as Scripture says, in the beginning, there was chaos, and then God spoke his word and gave order and truth and purpose to the chaos. Okay, when you think about it, think about a personal relationship. Have any of you ever been in an arbitrary personal relationship? Where the rules of the game constantly change. Yeah, it could be sometimes, unfortunately, with a parent who might be struggling with something, and they're arbitrary towards you. Sometimes it happens in a marriage when somebody runs away from the truth. It can happen in a job when you are doing the job and the boss has a favorite, right? And they get the promotion and you don't. It can happen on an athletic team where the coach has got a son or a daughter that starts instead of you. Let me ask you this question. In that type of relationship, an arbitrary relationship, where the rules of the game constantly change, can you have faith? I mean, what is faith? Faith is an anticipated outcome, is it not? And if you cannot anticipate any outcome, how can you anticipate or have faith? And let me ask you this, where you don't have faith, can you have hope? No, hope is an anticipated good outcome, and if you can't anticipate any outcome, you can't anticipate a good one. And where you don't have hope, you die. The assault upon truth is the assault upon the essence of your life. I get myself in trouble because I often say our highest calling in personal relationship to one another is not tolerance. You tolerate warts, not people. You have compassion and you love people. I'm so pleased when my mother tucked me in at night, she didn't say, "Oh, Phil, I tolerate you." Although at times she thought she tolerated me too much, she told me she loved me. I mean, image this for a second. Imagine you have a friend who's pouring their life into a bottle of alcohol, and you see their self-destruction. Is it truly friendship that stands back and says, "Who am I to say that's wrong? Who am I to proclaim that doesn't work for them? I come from a whole family. They come from a broken family. Alcohol doesn't work for me, but it might work for them." Is that friendship to witness the self-destruction of a friend? Or does a friend get engaged in another's life and say, "Look, I'm here to bring you a truth, a powerful truth, that there's a God who loves you, that there's more value to you than this bottle of alcohol, so I will not enable, I will not condone, I will not tolerate your own self-destruction." But what else does a friend do? "I will not abandon. I will stand by your side. I will suffer through the consequences of this brokenness with you. So through the truth of my love, you will have born a new hope." That's compassion. That's the foundation of truth in relationship. And God's truth permeates all of creation, does it not? You are here in this auditorium sitting in chairs designed to support you, because somebody who designed them understood some laws of physics, not proclivities or preferences of physics. I mean, imagine this, if you would. If I'm a recruiter for NASA and I walk into this room, and what's your name, sir?
Graham.
I'm sorry?
Graham.
Graham, I got this great idea. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build this ship. It's going to be made out of metal, and it's going to be about 20 stories tall. And I'm going to put you in the top of it, Graham, and we will light it underneath it, and it's going to explode. You can see it from 20 miles away. And Graham, I'll tell you what, we're going to shoot you out there where we think there's no oxygen, but don't worry, we'll put a little bubble on your head, and you'll be able to breathe a little bit, and we're going to plop you on the moon and bring you home. Could you do it without faith in the laws of physics? No, God's truth permeates all of creation. In fact, you are creators. You're created in the image of God, and you're constantly creating hopes, dreams, reputations, careers, families. You can't stop creating. It's so much a part of you. And every time you create, you're going to learn something. You're going to learn that you will suffer for your creation. That you will leave a part of yourself behind for your creation. Many of you go to college right now. Would you disagree that you're not suffering for your college education? If you go to law school, you're going to suffer and apply yourself through it. Do you know what suffering meant in the ancient Hebrew? To lift up to a higher purpose. To lift up to a higher purpose. And when you think about anything of value in your life, you will realize you have suffered for it, just as your parents, your forefathers, your foremothers, and those who came before you suffered, so that you might have the promise of what this nation is. You will suffer. But you will suffer willingly for an external truth because you have a passion that is written upon your heart, as Professor Chrisman said, that is written upon your heart, that you're willing to suffer for. And by the way, do you know what passion means? In the Latin, it means to suffer. And that is where we get the passion of Christ, a Savior who heard us and came down to lift us to a higher purpose. So what does this have to do with government? Professor Chrisman detailed that government doesn't have jurisdiction over all these things. And often that is something that is confused in our society today. When Christians speak of sin, automatically others who don't understand our faith believe we're saying that government should solve all sins. No, if government had jurisdiction over all sins, I'd be in prison. That's what my faith teaches me. But I have a Savior who is willing to lift me to a higher purpose, and fortunately, a belief that government doesn't have jurisdiction over all aspects of my life. Some rest in personal relationship, such as family. Some rest with church. And some rest with government. But still, truth is foundational to the laws of government. I, speaking to your colleagues, like to ask them, what's the calling of America? And most often the reply is democracy. Democracy is the reason that we fight overseas. Democracy is what attracts those from foreign soils to our shore. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. The sheep will always get eaten. We have the most anti-democratic document in human history called the Bill of Rights. It says if everybody in this room believed that Graham should not speak, but Graham desires to speak, that he has the right. That's anti-democratic. No, America's calling is much more than that. It's human dignity, founded in human exceptionalism. Recognize that all are created in the image of God. And this nation has struggled with that concept and wrestled with it for over 200 years. And we haven't fully delivered it to everybody. And often we denied it to many. I stand on soil right now. We're just over 150 years ago, people with a certain skin color were denied those rights. Oftentimes, our laws in the past denied women specific rights. But the kernel of truth reflected in that document has a power that's bigger than armies, that defeats racism and prejudice, that overcomes all obstacles till it is met and expressed in the human spirit. That's the power of God's truth. Now some will say, our power, our rights don't come from a God, they come from that piece of paper, the Bill of Rights. Have any of you ever been to the National Archives? The document, our Constitution, is in a vault. And it's in a vacuum chamber because oxygen has an effect on the parchment and erodes it. If it was placed in this room over time, it would crumble to dust. If you held it in front of you, it will not stop a bullet. It will not stop a fist. The only power in that document is if the truth of its words are reflected in the heart of a people. Only if the truth of its words are reflected in the heart of a people. Every year, state legislatures and Congress pass hundreds and thousands of new pages of laws and regulations. It has become so complex that you don't know half or nearly a tenth of the laws that regulate your life. And in that environment, when we worship government rather than liberty and the intrinsic value of human life, intrinsic, it is given to you by God. We don't measure your value based on what you can do in society, based on how much money you earn, based on the life that you have living, right? The years that you have to live. We base it on an intrinsic value. But when you have so many laws governing your life and you can't understand them and you don't know them, it affords for arbitrary government power. Because we worship government now. We look to government for our hope. We look to government for our salvation. We put our resources in government. And guess what government's going to do when we do that? It will rule your life. It will rule your life. But when it's not founded in truth, it can be very arbitrary indeed. And speaking to your colleagues, I'd like to ask them if they believe in absolute right or wrong. What do you believe that they say? No, it's about, I'd say it's about 80% in urban areas say there is no absolute truth. 70% in suburban America, 60% in rural America, and about 50-50 in Christian schools. So I like to ask them, who defines right or wrong for you? What do you think they say? They'll generally say government because, as Attorney General, I had a badge. I can get in the middle of your life, right? I can mess with you. They'll say government. So I challenge them a little bit further and say, okay, the year is 1855. I walk over to an African-American student, I put my hand on his or her shoulder, and I say, I own this man. I can beat him. It's not battery. I can shoot him. It's not murder. I could sell him. It's considered profit, right or wrong. What do you think they say?
Wrong.
They don't. Test it out. They respond with a question. Do you live in the North or the South? Because in the South in 1855, government said it's right, therefore it's right. In the North, government said it's wrong, therefore it's wrong. That's the sand that we stand on without the foundation of truth. The value of a human being defined by geography. So I'll challenge them a little bit further and I'll say, I'm going to take a baseball bat, I'm going to start beating this man. Will any of you stop me? And eventually a hand will raise in the air. I'll stop you, Mr. Kline. And I'll say, how dare you? How intolerant, dogmatic, closed-minded of you to presume your truth upon my relationship with my slave. Listen, my slave's dependent upon me for his food. I'm dependent upon my slave for my economic well-being. If you don't like slavery, you don't have to own one if you don't want to. Can you hear that message in our culture today? A message that silences a great people from proclaiming injustice. It is true, is it not, that we must be intolerant of injustice and fervored in promoting justice. And the foundation of justice is the recognition that each and every human being is created in the image of a God that has higher moral authority than any institution of man, any government of man, and that we must honor that value in just and righteous laws that promote liberty. It is truth that will give you the passion in life. It is truth that is the passion of law. And it is coming to know it for which you were created. Be glad to respond to any questions. Yeah.
I would just like to touch on what Professor Christmas said about the New Mexico case. Like you're saying, everyone has equal rights, but how come those photographers don't have the right to deny their services?
Well, it's an interesting question. And we are going more towards government is going to restrict liberty to provide answers it believes to be the best, because that's where we look for our answers. So we've afforded government that jurisdiction. And we shouldn't afford government certain jurisdictions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You know how you're saying a couple things. First of all, you know how you're saying most people say, well, law comes from government, but doesn't it ultimately come from God to begin with? And second one, that case you're talking about, the murder trial, what was the outcome of that?
Oh, he was found guilty.
And what was his sentence?
Life. So he's serving a life sentence. Thank you for asking that. And your first question, restate it again.
You know how you're talking about how a lot of people say that law comes from the government, but in a way, doesn't it ultimately come from God?
What happens over time to unjust laws? What happens to societies over time that do not promote justice and liberty? They crumble, no matter what their proclamations are. We could go through human history and we could find how many kings who built shrines indicating that they would live forever ever through their proclamations. And where are they now? Any government that moves away from the truth of this foundation is a government that over time perishes. Neither a people nor a person can claim the promise and live a lie. Eventually, it breaks down. So no matter how we beat our chests and scream and yell, if we are not rooted in truth, governments fade and they lose their power. And that is to be something hopeful for you. The human spirit for liberty cannot be contained perpetually. Deliverance is always present in God's truth. And over time, that truth prevails. Yeah.
In times when laws, and I mean, we live in those times, even in America, when laws are contrary to the laws of God, I mean, obviously we can do peaceful civil disobedience, but how far are we entitled to resist those laws? And is it dependent upon the nature of the law itself that's being resisted?
Well, there is one of the laws of our nation which most profoundly mocks the foundation of our nation and also an expression of God for love of those whom he created is our ability to end life in the womb, the most innocent life that's there, a life that is not acted in a way to afford government jurisdiction. John Henry Horton acted in a way that afforded government jurisdiction to confine him. He raped and killed a little girl, so government had the jurisdiction then to remove his liberty. An innocent life in the womb has not done anything for which government can have jurisdiction, nor any other person to end its life. Now let me speak briefly. That does not, I am not saying that abortion is a greater sin than other sins. I stand condemned as a sinner, and the foot of the cross is level, and God's grace and God's deliverance is available to all who avail themselves to the grace of Jesus Christ. But what I am saying is that government has jurisdiction to secure inherent rights, and that child is a creation of God and has inherent rights and intrinsic value. And this nation is mocking that value. We did that with another group of people at one time. And they were African Americans. Blacks on these shores were treated as property. And it led to the bloodiest conflict in United States history to end that injustice. I am not saying that that type of approach is warranted at this time. I do not advocate violence whatsoever. What I am saying is the march of history is clear. Over time, if you proclaim the promise and live a lie, conflict occurs and governments fall. That's the march of truth.